Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here with another episode of Explained. Today's topic is about guitar amplifiers, the different technologies that drive guitar amp circuits, the pros and cons of each, the best use cases for each model, all that good stuff. And this episode is kind of going to feel a lot like one of the earliest that I've done for this series, which revolved around overdrive pedals, distortion pedals, in the same ways that some pedal manufacturers might swap around vocabulary to the point that it just doesn't mean anything anymore. Some amp manufacturers do something very similar. So we're going to be talking about where the lines are drawn, where they're a little bit more fuzzy, and the good, the bad, the ugly, about all things guitar amplifiers. So let's clear up some vocabulary before we begin. A lot of novice players, or people who are just learning the instrument, when they think guitar amp, they think of a little square box with a single speaker and some EQ controls, gain, volume, whatever. And that's a combo amplifier that has the amplifier portion plus a built-in speaker cabinet. And I had to explain that to someone like 2.5 times my age one time, and it kind of blew my mind. But it makes sense, because a lot of even retailers will go as far to say, this is an amplifier. No, that's not an amplifier. That's a speaker cabinet. This is the amplifier. And if it has something built together, that's a combo amp. So for 99% of the people that view this channel, that's not an issue. But let's just be clear that they are very separate circuits. All you're doing is driving speakers with the amplifier. The amplifier is doing all the work. So let's talk about the three principal technologies that drive amplifier circuits. You have tube-based, you have solid-state-based, and digital modeling, and we'll touch on hybrid, which can pick and choose different elements of each. So let's start with tube amps. They're the ones that get the most notoriety. That's kind of what a guitar sound is, at least that's what's been rooted in popular culture. Even most dictionary definitions, most people think of a guitar amp, they think of a Marshall half stack. That's just the image, because it is such an iconic look. The reason amp heads have taken on the iconic rectangular shape is because above all these tone controls, you have a lot of these to deal with. So behind the grill of this amp, you have 5 of these preamp tubes and 4 power tubes. And we'll talk about a bit more of the finer details in a moment. But for now, really the preamp is just where most of your tone creation is going on. It's where you're introducing gain and clipping to get distortion. It's where you're messing with the tone stack EQ, and then you're sending that to a power amp to make it louder. And it does color your tone a little bit depending on what tubes and the circuitry of the power amp itself, but for the most part, we're talking about preamps. So why are most iconic guitar amps driven by tubes or valves if you live across the pond? Mainly because they're just super well suited for the application. Vacuum tubes like high voltage, low current circuits, they're extremely resilient, even though you would think, something that's blown glass and just has a few pins would be more, receptive to damage, but not really. They're used in industrial and military applications from their inception. They're good with heat. They can withstand overvoltage for a lot longer period of time compared to most other solid state components. But what really sealed the deal for amplifiers are their nice soft clipping quality. And what I mean by that is when you take, say, a sinusoidal wave and you're driving it so hard you run out of bandwidth, and you take the tops of those waves and the troughs of those waves and cut them and make them square waves. That's clipping. And compared to other stuff like FETs or other solid state pieces, this just creates a more warm, I hate to use those kind of subjective attributes, but it's a certain sound that has become embedded into people's ear, because that's what the earliest recordings were of guitars were all made from, were valve or tube amplifiers. Because of that, you could produce this tonally rich harmonic sound that, especially in the earlier iterations of guitar amps, really complemented the speakers and the instruments and the pickups used at that time. With that soft clipping, even on lower gain applications, you just get this nice driven, bright top end while retaining a well-rounded guitar sound and covering a broad frequency of spectrums while still sounding mid-heavy and how a guitar should sound. Of course, nowadays, most guitarists are turning to tube amps not for low gain applications, but for rock and metal tones. And of course, tube technology was responsible for most of the iconic rock and metal sounds that we associate with today, including, Marshall JCM 800, Mesa Boogie Dual Rectifier, the Peavey and Fender 5150s, and so many more. And really the methodology remains the same. You're just adding a few more gain stages together to create that hard clipping high gain sound. And it still retains a lot of the tube tonal qualities that people associate with it. By all accounts in this video so far, tube technology is the way to go for any electric guitar application. So why are we moving more and more away from tube amps, especially in the past 10 years, but really in the past 25? Well, they definitely have their disadvantages. Number one, look how big these things are. This is even a smaller size as far as a traditional tube amp head would go. And of course there's lunchbox sizes, that sort of thing, but you're still making several compromises in those designs. So first of all, tubes are hot as hell because you have to have a cathode style heater, especially more importantly on the power tubes. And so that requires a heat up time, which is why you have a standby switch. So you can't play them immediately. It's not a big deal. You can, flip the on switch while you're setting everything else up. But with that comes some, reliability concerns, especially out on the road. Some of them will burn up, some of them will, the heater element will go out, and then you got to get that repaired. So that does somewhat suck. With the obvious size increase comes increased weight. So if it's a one-time move it and set it down type of application, doesn't really matter. But if you're a touring band, it gets real old real quick moving all these amp heads back and forth, especially if you are flying in somewhere. It's almost impossible to do unless you are, Metallica or Rolling Stones and you have different rigs that you can send across the world, because these things have become pretty much impractical. Again, there are lunchbox size amps, but they're usually using only a couple preamp tubes, and they're cheating it with other hybrid designs to get them down to be that small. While tubes are very robust, like I said earlier, they do have a working lifespan. So unlike something like, say, a silicon diode that you could find in pretty much any overdrive pedal, those things will pretty much last until the end of time. I mean, you could eventually wear it out, I guess, in theory, but that's not something that you really replace because that part goes bad. Tubes, on the other hand, they do wear out. They can become microphonic over time as well, which means that it can pick up sounds, it can pick up your voice after long periods of time. And so they do need to be changed and swapped. Another issue is that the longer we go, they're becoming more and more difficult to manufacture because of environmental concerns. And so a lot of them are coming from overseas in China and Russia, and some of them are still very good quality, but many of them just are not. The tubes in this amp are pretty much Chinese rejects that work, but yeah, it could definitely stand an upgrade for sure. And probably the most pertinent point for most players is the expense. The tube replacement kits for even a relatively simply designed tube amp can cost a lot more than a solid state combo amp. Again, a lot of that comes with weight and the general size of tube amps, but a lot of it is complications with the circuitry design and failure rates and all the other components you need to make all that work. So yeah, that's why most people don't buy a tube amp when they're just starting out. You get the little combo blackface amp with Fender starter kits or Epiphones or whatever, and then you move up to something decent later on. But yeah, tube amps, even on their lower range, which they are, there are more SKUs every year that are kind of dipping down into that mid-range level, which I think is great. But again, they still do have a lot of drawbacks, which you just need to be aware of if that's what you're looking for. But when it comes to guitar tone that has been just embedded into people's minds for the past 60 or so years at this point, tubes is where you're going to get it at the source. So let's get back to that small combo amp example that we were talking about earlier. Probably most of us grew up or started playing guitar on something similar that just had an awful overdrive channel. It was never loud enough. Even the clean channel was buzzy, and it sounded like an ice pick going in your ears, had no low end, and just was not a good time all around. Now that's an example of a solid state amp, and as a result has kind of unfortunately and unfairly given this very negative association with solid state amps for a lot of guitarists. But don't let that fool you. There are some great solid state amps out there. So when we're talking solid state, we're really talking about silicon transistors and semiconductors that go in the place of tubes for amp circuitry. Now, it's not as simple as just taking out a tube and picking apart your calculator and throwing chips in there and expecting it to work. You actually have to, design the circuitry a little bit differently, but they do perform very similar tasks as a tube would. Solid state components do have a number of advantages over their tube counterparts. So first of all, they're cheap. And partially because they are so much smaller and they weigh a lot less, so that cuts into manufacturing and shipping costs. And you can create smaller packages out of it. So that's why you see so many solid state amps that are so inexpensive, like $100 for a combo amp, which you're not going to find a tube amp, let alone a combo that costs in that range. Like I said earlier, tubes are fairly robust, but you really don't have to worry about solid state components in terms of working life. If you get your amp in and it works and you don't spill water or beer on it and it's not subject to just an awful working environment, it's probably going to be just fine. It's not something like a tube where you know 5 to 10 years down the road, depending on how many hours you put on it, you're going to have to replace. If something goes wrong on a solid state board, probably the whole board is screwed. And not really an advantage, but not really an objective disadvantage either, is that solid state components just sound different than tubes. Good or bad, it's up to you. There are some great solid state sounding amps, in my opinion. I love a lot of the older Randall stuff, which is associated with Pantera a lot of the times, or early Death albums. With Death, Chuck Schuldiner eventually switched to Marshall valve states, which is one of those hybrid amps that uses partially tube tech in the preamp and the rest of it's all solid state. But at least from what I read, you could just like take the tube out and it does absolutely nothing different. So it probably wasn't utilizing that in the circuitry very much. But great sounding guitar amp on, say, Flesh and the Power It Holds. No overdrive, just a really high output humbucker going through a half stack, and sounded great. One of my favorite metal, just traditional metal guitar sounds ever. And that's solid state. And it does not sound like a tube amp. And I think that's the fallacy of a lot of newer solid state equipped amps, is that they are ultimately trying to emulate something that isn't tube, which is unfortunate. I know my Marshall 250 DFX kind of did that. Of course, that's a fairly old amp now, but they were kind of going that route of trying to make it too mid-heavy, and it just lacks all the dynamics and the things we associate with tube amps. So I feel like if they would just stick more with what they do well, you would have better products overall. Say like the Roland Jazz Chorus, a still very legendary amp to this day. Entirely clean. It does have built-in chorus and reverb, which Roland has always been really good at digital effects, so that still lives up. But you have metal guitarists like James Hetfield that uses it for its clean sound. Obviously jazz guitarists like it because it was made for them, because there is practically no clipping at all. It is just a super smooth, consistent sound, but you still get this warmth to it. Again, hate using that word for this, but it is a very distinctive, good guitar tone that's not tube based. And personally, I think the best thing about solid state amps is that until they became prevalent in the early 80s, there was really no other way to get into guitar playing than just going out and buy the lesser expensive tube amps, which kind of sucked. That was a big chunk of money back then. It still is today, but back then amps cost about the same as they do now, dollar for dollar, and then you account for inflation. It's like you could buy a car for what a decent amplifier costs. But then once solid states kind of became a little bit more prevalent, you could get a garage band going without spending 2 months worth of a paycheck on a single piece of gear, which is a good thing, and I think continues to be a good thing as it fills in kind of that lower gap that is left by tube amps. Now, I think one of the follies of the industry because of that mentality is they don't really advertise the differences very well. If it's a tube amp, you're going to know it's a tube amp. They're going to say, has this many preamp tubes, this many power tubes that can be changed out with this, blah, blah, blah. They make sure you know. For solid state amps, especially in lesser expensive options, they just use a bunch of buzzwords, say, yeah, iconic guitar tones, this is the Marshall sound, this is whatever, and a lot of the times you get a novice player, they're not going to look any further than that. So I think that is a problem that kind of exists in the overdrive and distortion pedals, where they interchange words and not really telling you what you're getting, so you make a lot of uninformed purchases early on if you're not up to speed on these sort of things. I think the far more egregious act is swapping vocabulary with the next set of amp technology, digital modeling, because some guitar sites and sellers still call amp modelers solid state amps, and you're not technically wrong, because yes, they are using solid state components, there's no tubes in there, but it goes about it in such a fundamentally different way that's it's not solid state. A solid state circuit is basically a regular amp circuit, but you're just replacing different components. A digital modeler is basically a computer that is emulating a circuit. When talking about digital modelers, we really have to start at the core, which is the DSP, digital signal processor. And you can kind of think of it as the CPU in your phone or in your desktop. And really it's just a specialized chip that can process audio information and transform it really quickly, because that's something that's very important with sound in general, especially playing an instrument. Going through a real tube circuit happens pretty much at the speed of light. So you have to be able to replicate that if you're going to take something in the digital realm, transform it back into something we listen to, which was very hard to do early on, and which is why the algorithms and the processes that were used kind of sucked, because they had to cut a lot of corners to get it fast enough to where it was actually playable, and not 15 or 40 milliseconds of latency that at that point becomes just a gargled mess. Older modelers from the likes of Boss or Line 6 definitely don't hold up quite as well today, but even the newest generation of tech do pretty much the same thing. So Axe-Fx, Kemper, Line 6 Helix, they're all basically copying the amp circuitry of a real amplifier, putting it into a digital model, and then send out the signal. And some people think, oh, there's no way you can capture the sound, the magic of a real tube amp. But honestly, there's nothing magical about any of this. This is all man-made. It's all been wired. Someone has a CAD drawing of all the schematics and all the errors of what each component can be. You can do that in any digital model. It's really, there's no mental gymnastics required to get over that fact. A lot of the magic comes from the error between amps. No tube production amps, two tube production amps sound the same. You can take two dual rectifiers and they're going to sound a little bit different. And they're going to sound a little bit different day to day. But with the tools that you have available with digital modeling, a lot of the times you can make it sound better than the real thing, especially when you implement good cabinet emulation and good emulation of all the other effects. Just like how many guitarists had their taste for solid state amps completely ruined during their formative years because they also played on lesser expensive models, the digital modeling of years past kind of did the same thing, because they just didn't sound all that realistic or good or fun to play. Although nowadays with the technology that's out there, even with a lot of the sub $1,000 tech, they fail blind tests all the time compared to the real thing. And a lot of the touring bands you see nowadays, even if you see some real cabs or real amps, a lot of what's going to the front of house speakers is probably digital in one way or another. And that brings us to one of the biggest advantages of digital modeling in general, is that you can achieve the same sound every time. Every night, every system, you can make it sound exactly the same. You don't have to worry about humidity, or just the amp wants to act like an idiot that day, or it just doesn't sound good. I mean, it changes day to day with real tube circuitry, but with digital modelers, it's all happening through a computer chip, more or less, and it's the same. And you can switch through patches. You have all your other effects for more complicated modelers, and it's just such a a convenience factor, if nothing else. That's why for recording, I use my AX8 hands down 95% of the time, because it's just a plug and play option. I can tweak in real time, and ain't got to worry about hooking all these other cables up, or worrying about tubes warming up, or worrying about this and that. It's just a super convenient option. It also has a lot better value proposition for recording and just gigging artists. If you don't record a full-length album every 2 years, and you don't play stadiums and do all this other stuff, it just makes more sense nowadays to have something that can do all these myriad of tones and do them very well, if not better than the real thing a lot of the times, as long as you have compatible gear for it. Because you can buy a lot of these modelers for, again, in the $1,000 to $1,500 range, and that's kind of the cost of a tube amp head alone, not including everything else you need to make it work. Many modelers get great post-launch support, so what you buy, you might get another 50 amps later down the road, or a few more extra drive pedals. And even if you don't, you can always download the community's patches that they've made and tweak them to your heart's desire. And more is more when it comes to this sort of thing, in my opinion. The downside is that some people just don't like the digital experience, and I get it. For me, a floorboard model that I can tweak with my computer if need be is exactly right up my alley. Some people don't like that quite as well, which is why the Kemper got fairly popular, is because it's a head-shaped digital modeler that you can tweak the same way. But others, rack units, that sort of thing, it just ain't going to fly for people that like to, twist physical knobs and feel the heat off of the tubes and that sort of thing. And that's totally fair. But if you just are worried about tone, I think we're pretty much there with digital modeling to the point that it doesn't make sense for most people to go out and spend the money that a lot of these cost unless it's just really what you want to do. That's totally fine. But if I think it makes more sense to get a decent digital solution before you even worry about any of that. So to wrap it all up, tube amps are really the cornerstone of guitar tone. That's what most people think of when they think of guitar sound, whether it be a classic overdriven Marshall or a totally spanky clean Fender amp. It's in every genre, and it's kind of hard to get away from. Solid state amps can be just as good for their particular applications. They just sound different. They clip a different way. They handle a different way, and if it works for your music, your genre, then great. But a lot of people just aren't looking for that sound anymore. And digital modelers aim to achieve the boutique sound without the price tag or inflexibility of a lot of those rigs. And that's probably my personal favorite of the three technologies now, because of how much I've enjoyed playing through VST plugins and modelers and getting kind of a taste of different rigs. And it's really allowed me to shape what my guitar sound is, because 20 years ago, you wouldn't be able to do that. You'd be hunting, picking amps, listening to a bunch of albums and thinking, I think I want that one. But unless you just knew someone with 10 different amp heads, you were kind of guessing a little bit. But with models, I can have a pretty good idea of what fits for me. So if I had one piece of feedback for the market in general, it'd be label your shit better. This is the second episode where we're talking about things that just aren't explained all that well, and pickups aren't quite there yet either, but I feel like they're a little bit more cut and dry. But yeah, we got a lot of amp manufacturers that are making lower end products that try to sell it being something that it's not, and it kind of pisses me off when people who are just getting into the hobby are probably buying stuff they wouldn't if they had known better. And that kind of, it's that way with any technology heavy subject, but it's kind of real bad with guitars, I feel like. So that's why I would give the general message: if you need to play something out loud, you need to gig, you need to do whatever, then I think it's fine to look at more traditional options. But me personally, I would have something that's powered and run digital in this day and age. I just think that's an easier solution for people that are playing covers and doing those sorts of applications. So yeah, they're all good. They can all be bad. There's no right or wrong answer. Hopefully we all come out learning a little bit more about all the amp technologies though at the end of the day. So hope you enjoyed that one, and hope to see you on another episode of Explained in the near future. Thanks for watching. Bye.